Meep.
How the hell did we get here? For as unethical and misguided as it was, Dahmer, at the very least, was a good show. Well written, excellently performed, beautifully shot, thematically challenging, all that jazz. And coming from co-creators Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan, it felt like a step forward on a path that I was genuinely excited to see them go down. But then, last year, they decided to take 2 steps backward with Monsters, the Lyle and Eric Menendez story, which, apart from one key episode, consistently showcased the worst of their creative impulses: gratuity, voyeurism, campiness, etc. It felt a bit like a spit in the faces of not just the real people whose stories they were attempting to tell, but of their own creative collaborators who worked hard on that first season. So needless to say, this latest season, Monster, the Ed Gein Story, had a bit of an uphill battle to fight. I desperately needed this season to show me even a faint glimmer of creative integrity by bringing the series back to more somber, thought-provoking storytelling and proving to me, once and for all, that the show's many accomplishments weren't just flukes. And pinch me, I must be dreaming, because this season is infinitely worse than I thought possible. Saying that this show is worse than I imagined feels a little strange, given that Monster, the Ed Gein Story is in many ways exactly what I've come to expect. The show is presumably about Ed Gein, a serial killer and grave robber from Wisconsin in the 1950s. Once again, filmmaking techniques from dramas, character studies, and horror films are adopted to tell this real-world story, carried by a harrowing central performance that is meant to ground the show in some sort of believability, even though, per usual, much of the true story has been reduced down or even outright fictionalized to make it more palatable and entertaining, but done so under the guise of having conversations and asking hard-hitting thematic questions, mainly, what makes a monster? Not a question that is unworthy of exploring, but one that, because of the way it is often explored here, continuously diminishes the experiences and perspectives of the real-world victims being portrayed, while also, at times, mythologizing or even fetishizing the killer. Episode 1 of the show perfectly follows this formula, doing things like being as ham-fisted as possible with Ed Gein's tragic backstory in order to try and garner the audience's sympathy, employing an overly operatic tone that turns Gein's macabre obsessions into something spiritual or poetic, being extremely gratuitous in showing his deviancy and parading him around like some sort of serial killer Ken doll, as well as fully visualizing Ed's delusions and throwing many pure fictions into the mix, capped off by insisting the significance of certain events or triggers as a genesis for Ed Gein's crimes, to the point of feeling like a contrived origin story. This all does occasionally raise some valid, thought-provoking questions, like, what impact does seeing violent historical imagery have on a person and on a society? Or how do we expect people to cope with abuse and trauma while being completely isolated? But it all comes at the cost of feeling too reductive, gross, and exploitative to actually have any of its intended impact. But the thing is, none of what I just explained is even remotely surprising at this point, and if that's where discussion around this show began and ended, I probably wouldn't even be making this video right now, because what else is there to say at this point? But fortunately for me, and unfortunately for literally everyone else, the show is just getting started. When I first laid eyes on this season's marketing, which repeatedly drew comparison between Ed Gein and fictional horror films, I tried to rationalize it as just that, marketing. A clever, albeit tasteless way to entice people to engage with the series. But no, that is the show. But wait, you might think, this is nothing new. The show has always intentionally commented on itself, right?
Eric, they're gonna make a movie about us.
Yes, that is true, but the degree to which it is done here is unprecedented. The entire middle chunk of this season is one giant metatextual exercise that examines how these real-life crimes became the blueprint for American horror mythology. The Ed Gein story, as it turns out, is more of a loose term, meaning not just his literal story, but also the fictional stories based on him that we've culturally passed down through the years, like Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. Which is a bit ambitious and bizarre coming from a show that has consistently had trouble balancing the reality of its subject matter with its fictionalized design, something I've repeatedly attempted to emphasize in my analysis as a means of showing how these real-world crimes were reduced down to genre, and in turn, why that's such a questionable and messy thing to do. But this time around, I've sort of been beaten at my own game because the show has pretty much done my job for me. And I do have to admit that this isn't necessarily the worst idea for a true crime story. Like, I can see the vision. You first give the audience the true events and then show them how those events have been mythologized, hopefully in an attempt to ultimately strip away the myth and leave the audience with the sad and unglamorous reality, which is something that this creative team has consistently stated was a goal of theirs, to find the man beneath the mythological monster. Problem is, that's not what this show does. What this show really aims to do is mythologize Ed Gein all over again, to properly credit him as the first celebrity serial killer and as the source of so much creative inspiration, to show you, hey, all that stuff you love, it all comes from this one guy. If Dahmer was true crime's equivalent to a comic book villain origin story, and Monsters Menendez was true crime's satirical soap opera, then Monster Ed Gein is true crime's version of the musical biopic. This show has the same saccharine reverence for Ed Gein that Walk the Line had for Johnny Cash. Actually, I'd even go a step further and say that this show is so campy, self-referential, and exaggerative that it's more akin to a parody of a musical biopic, in the same vein as things like Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story.
You think we don't know what you're talking about when you say, take my hand?
What do you mean? It's about holding hands.
You watch your mouth.
You know who's got hands? The devil. And he uses them for holding.
I ain't got no room in my house for no devil spawn.
You won't touch her. You will never touch a woman. You won't be marrying one. You understand me? It's sin, Eddie. Women are sin.
Or Weird, the Al Yankovic story.
Changing the lyrics to a well-known song? No, boy, what you're doing is confusing and evil. My God, and I will not have that kind of blasphemy in my own home.
Oh, no. No, you don't. Not in this house.
I can't stay a bachelor forever.
Not that Jezebel. Pandora is what she is. Pandora with that stinking filthy box.
Why is my innocent young child wearing that devil's squeeze box?
That's actually our newest...
I thought I told you to shut up!
I'm sorry, Augusta. I'm sorry.
You darken this doorway again, George Gein. And that'll be the last thing you ever do.
That's not a parody!
shouldn't be watching this.
Get me my accordion.
Okay, all jokes aside, I know that saying that this show feels like an Ed Gein puff piece sounds like a bad faith reading, but keep in mind that if it's not immediately self-evident, this also comes straight from the horse's mouth. Pretty much all of the major creatives behind this show have stated how fascinated they are by Ed Gein's cultural impact, and how they wanted to make that impact more widely known through this show. While I entirely disagree with this framing, given that 1, Ed Gein being usurped in popular culture by the fictions he helped inspire is arguably a good thing, and 2, no great art is worth this much human suffering, I do think there maybe could have been a way to pull this off. To give the audience a historical account of how Ed Gein's story has been passed down through the ages and why it still resonates to this day. And to try and give the show some credit, I do think that is somewhat conveyed here through heavy-handed dialogue from fictionalized versions of real-world film directors like Alfred Hitchcock or Tobe Hooper, stating things like, "We still tell this same story because it's much more sinister to think of a monster who is not a creature, but instead a fellow human being."
Frankenstein, Phantom of the Opera. They won't cut it anymore. Our audience has found a new monster. That monster is us.
Or that America's history and publicizing of violence puts it in the forefront of our minds on a daily basis, including the minds of those with sinister intent.
Ed Gein couldn't get over the pictures he saw of World War II. World War II drove him literally insane, those images. Can you imagine if he saw what we're doing in Vietnam?
Eddie, it really seemed like the trigger was these photographs.
And had he not seen them?
Might have stayed a small-town simpleton.
Such is the power of the photographed image.
But wait a minute. If all of this is true, and violent images are this incredibly powerful, then doesn't that kind of put this entire show into question? Well, that's something that this creative team also seemed keen to talk about. Charlie Hunnam, the actor who plays Ed Gein, and Max Winkler, the director of 3/4 of this season, have both posited some variation of the question, who's the real monster here? Ed Gein or the filmmakers who tell his story? And by God, if they really want an answer to that question, I'm gonna give them one. While art will inevitably say something about the artist creating it, I don't believe that art paints broad enough strokes to give you a full picture. I've just never been a fan of making sweeping judgments about someone based solely on their creative output, but this show has practically forced my hand. This season is very much preoccupied with, quoting Ian Brennan, turning the camera on ourselves, on Ryan and I, and our audience. So if I want to do what I've always aimed to with my criticism, that being judge the show's effectiveness based on the goals it sets out to achieve, then I kind of have to read into it a bit. And that does not bode well for anyone creatively involved here. This show positions itself as contributing to a legacy of powerful art, driven by people like Hitchcock and Hooper and even David Fincher. As if Monster is now metaphorically being passed the baton, carrying the torch of the Ed Gein story. As laughable as it is for this show to equate itself to these giants, it does offer some interesting insight into why filmmakers are so drawn to this particular set of crimes, or at least why this creative team thinks they are, beyond our societal fears and history of violent imagery, what the Ed Gein story seems to think is this. All of these artists are attracted to Ed Gein's crimes because they're sick voyeurs, peeping toms who get off on fictionalizing and perverting real-world trauma in order to make their audience uncomfortable.
I like the screaming.
And even give a middle finger to society at large.
I'm not making the movie this country wants. I'm making the movie it deserves. They created it. The ugliness, the violence, the cruelty, the depravity, the lies. So this is what they get.
Who see themselves as having metaphorically created a monster of their own, having nothing but contempt for their audience.
The audience has changed, and I'm the one who changed them. They'll want more and more and more, like hogs who've tasted blood. There's no going back. Not now.
Which is quite a baffling and barefaced admission, one that I'd almost respect the honesty of if the people saying it didn't, in the same breath, go around in interviews spouting off about how they're doing important work and that they're not sensationalizing, glamorizing, or heroicizing anything. In fact, according to Ian Brennan, they're not even humanizing serial killers, they're instead Homo sapiensizing them. Whatever the hell that means. This show has always had this frustrating, we can play in the mud and not get our hands dirty mentality, where it believes that commenting on its role in this sensationalism is enough to deny its own involvement or absolve it of accountability. The people behind this show genuinely seem to think that they alone know how to handle this stuff responsibly. They would never do anything other than try to find the man and the monster in the most ethical and well-researched way possible. So well-researched that they can solve 70-year-old cold cases and give you definitive answers as to why someone like Ed Gein turned out the way he did. This entire middle chunk of the show doesn't so much feel like a recounting of how filmmakers passed down the Ed Gein story. Instead, it feels like the show is trying to drag everything else that came before it down to its level, in an attempt to ultimately try to claw its way up and above it all. While a film like Psycho certainly has a complicated place in film history, filled with much controversy, trauma, and sadness, at least both it and Texas Chainsaw Massacre had the decency to create fiction out of Ed Gein instead of touting itself as the genuine article. And sure, Mindhunter was a stepping stone to this very show's existence, but it's also diametrically opposed to what this show does in just about every way imaginable. I mean, how? How is it even possible that a show this meta completely lacks any and all self-awareness? Again, I'd almost have more respect for the show if it just leaned into the whole, yeah, we're sick fucks and you are too and everyone loves it thing it does, but instead, especially when turning the camera back around to its audience, it feels like the creatives are not only deflecting responsibility, but doing so in an incredibly mean-spirited way. This show took what was, in reality, a casual relationship between Ed Gein and a woman named Adeline Watkins, and turns it into some sort of apprenticeship? Adeline constantly shows Ed Gein violent imagery to inspire him, encourages him to do things to the bodies.
Maybe you should do it with somebody who can't say no. Somebody dead.
Things he never did in reality, and even photographs his handiwork to use as a part of her resume. At one point, she moves to New York City, and after she fails to become a crime scene photographer, she beats an older woman near to death with her high heel, then returns home so her mother can tell her the reason that Adeline is so messed up is because she wasn't supposed to have been born.
I threw myself down the stairs. And I think those stairs are what did the number on you, why you're so gall-darn peculiar, why you embarrass yourself. And me, you are unnatural.
And then, at the very end of the show, Adeline confesses to Gein that she's thinking about following in his serial killing footsteps after he's been committed to a mental institution. Remember, the real-life Adeline Watkins never did any of that. All of it is completely made up. Even in the context of the show, she might be nothing more than Ed Gein's hallucination. It's kind of left up to interpretation, like it's the ending of Inception or something. But Ian Brennan says, "She's real to me, damn it." God. Now this begs the question, why? Why would you do that? Well, this too can largely be explained by the show's metatextual approach. Adeline Watkins is the true crime audience surrogate character, planted into the story as a means of warning the audience about the dangers of being fascinated by murder. Again, this comes straight from the source. Quoting Ian Brennan, she gets to the central theme of the show, which is be careful what you look at and be careful what you watch. Images can be corrosive, and they can stick with you and change you. And we, along with Ed, we sort of watch her go down a rabbit hole into something quite dark and quite scary. This is what the show thinks of its audience.
Eat your cotton picking dinner you didn't lift a finger for. Then pull yourself together and go find a husband who will put up with your lunatic horse shit. Blink of an eye, you're an old maid like me, except you won't have a batshit Nimrod daughter you're ashamed of like I do. So, small mercies.
Make of that what you will. If the central theme of this show really is be careful what you watch, if what is put on the screen is so impactful that it can fundamentally change you as a person, then why on earth did they put so little forethought into what this show presents? To say that this is the most haphazardly constructed season of the show thus far would be a massive understatement. When the show's penultimate episode is mostly anchored by a hallucinatory quote-unquote gimmick of heavy-handed expository dialogue ironically delivered via ham radio, all of which was not only made up as they were shooting, but was so bizarre that even one of the actors involved couldn't make any sense of it, well, that just about says it all, doesn't it? Charlie Hunnam described Ryan Murphy as approaching this project with childlike enthusiasm, emphasizing how f***ing stoked Murphy was to make this season. And Murphy himself has explained that this enthusiasm doesn't really stem from the crimes themselves. No, he's more interested in what surrounds the crimes. And yeah, all of that is pretty apparent here. For a show called The Ed Gein Story, it is oddly comfortable going on complete tangents to depict so many things that are, at best, tangentially connected, like Ilsa Koch's atrocities during World War II, or the lives of filmmakers and actors, or things that are, at worst, flatly made up, complete fabrications that are depicted with childish, borderline sadistic glee. All in service of putting you into the mind of a man whose life, according to these people, was something entirely made up in his head. Ed Gein was an quote-unquote unreliable narrator of his own life that, quote, contains multitudes of tone and subject matter. And what does the season really have to show for itself by the end? What does it actually have to say about the subject it's pretending to explore? Well, for starters, Ed Gein did it all because he was schizophrenic.
And what you call it? Skedaddle.
Schizophrenia, Ed. You're schizophrenic.
It is that way I do the things that I do.
Yes.
In the end, Ed Gein was just a sweet, mentally disturbed, silly little guy who just wanted to make Mama proud. I mean, sure, he killed a few people, but along the way, he inspired so much great art that we love to this day. Great art that was somehow also a stain on Ed Gein's wonderful life story, unlike some other shows out there, wink wink.
Ed, there have been so many folks who've taken your story and twisted it, used it for their own devices, added things that weren't real, taken out things that were horrible. So I think you ought to think about telling your own story, setting the record straight.
I think enough people have told my story. They seem to know it better than me.
I wish I could say that I'm being uncharitable, or that it's not as bad as it sounds, or that it was done with the best of intentions. And hell, it might have been done with the best possible intentions that this creative team could muster, but it doesn't really matter when the execution is this comically awful. Like, would you believe me if I told you that this show ends with Ed Gein dying and being welcomed into serial killer heaven via an elaborate dance sequence, capped off by Ed Gein's mom appearing and telling her son how proud she is of him?
You sure did make something of yourself, didn't you? All those motion pictures they made about you and all those killers who thought you were just the bee's knees. In the end, you actually accomplished something. You changed the whole world.
Again, it's so saccharine and goofy that it feels like parody.
I'm sorry for blaming you, Dewey. Of course, you didn't mean to cut Nate in half. It's all so obvious now. I should have been a better father to you, Dewey. I wish I spent more time playing catch with you and less time training my body and mind to kill you in a machete fight.
And to make matters worse, the show spends its final 2 episodes essentially backpedaling a lot of what the show spent 3/4 of its runtime exploring. Going back for a second to that bizarre ham radio gimmick that I mentioned earlier, one of the conversations had during this gimmick is between Ed Gein and Christine Jorgensen, an actual real-life historical trans woman, one of the most highly publicized trans women ever, in fact, who, in reality, was not connected to Ed Gein in any conceivable way, but for the purposes of this story, she is. And in this particular scene, she's basically only here for the sole purpose of looking straight into the camera and telling the audience that Ed Gein is not transgender.
Ed, I don't think you and I are alike at all. The transsexual is rarely the perpetrator of violence, Mr. Gein. We are far more likely to be the victims of violence.
Even though the entire first half of the show leads us on as if he is trans, feeling directly inspired by Christine Jorgensen, and that he feels internalized shame every time he expresses his gender identity, mainly due to his religious upbringing. The show even doubles down on this by insinuating that Gein lived a double life akin to that of closeted gay actor Anthony Perkins, baiting the audience into believing that this double life led to many of his crimes.
Gein had a secret, a sexual dysfunction he could not express, and his inability to express his version of the sexual act turned inwards and transformed into sickness. I had to cast you, Anthony. You're like him.
Which, intentionally or not, plants the seed that transness is equivalent to violence. A little late to be walking all that back this close to the finish line, don't you think? Need I remind you that this ham radio gimmick was something they reportedly wrote as they were shooting? This entire speech feels tacked on, coming off as damage control for the show's harmful stereotypical depictions, made all the worse given the year this show is releasing in. But hey, at least they spelled it out for the audience, I guess? As long as you add a hee hee, just kidding at the end, it's all good, apparently. Even more egregiously, the show fully expects you to feel bad for Ed Gein, the very guy who they've essentially characterized as a violent Looney Tunes character who has done absolutely deplorable, heinous things, some of which he didn't even do in real life. But oh, if he weren't so socially isolated, if we just cared more about mental health care in this country, if he could have just taken the magic pill sooner, all of this could have been avoided.
Funding for mental health in this country has been slashed and slashed and slashed again. This place is no better than a human zoo. I feel for you, Ed. I truly do. Mental hospital used to be a place of compassion and rehabilitation.
In the end, it was us. We make monsters of men so we can put all of society's ills on them. We make them a scapegoat and cast them away to rot.
They make monsters, the people, because they need someone to blame for the acts of the human condition.
It doesn't matter if I get better or if I get worse. Nobody cares. It's just punishment. That's part of the punishment, isn't it? It's not just that you're locked up. It's that you're locked up with this lie. That there's a purpose to it.
And when in doubt, if none of that does anything for you, you could always blame the women in these killers' lives, especially their mothers, a strange through line that connects every season of this show so far together. I want to stress that it's not as if mental health care and scapegoating aren't important things to discuss in this case. This is just not the proper execution. Any powerful questions this blending of reality and fiction could potentially ask of the audience quickly evaporate by the time we reach the show's overly simplistic and prescriptive ending. A jumbled together atonal note that is meant to reflect Gein's dark legacy, but is ultimately purported to be the ending we all wanted for him, the one he deserved. Why couldn't someone have thought of poor Ed Gein? He wasn't like them other serial killers. He was a gentle soul.
He's one of the more gentle monsters. Monstrous, no doubt, but, you know, he has his gentle side too.
Well, at least he found peace in the end, and he's still with us in spirit. All this metatextual examination of Ed Gein's life and legacy, all these attempts to get you to contemplate the broader picture, just to circle back around and beat you over the head with the most ham-fisted, melodramatic ending possible. One that pretty much just sits you down and insists you feel a certain way, even if it directly contradicts everything you've been shown before. And yet, for me at least, the only legacy this season of Monster managed to properly dissect and dismantle was its own. I never thought I'd be looking back at Netflix's Dahmer with rose-colored glasses. I genuinely saw it at the time as a messy foundation, a stepping stone toward a new, brighter horizon. In the wake of Monsters Menendez and now Monster Ed Gein, however, it feels more like an omen, a warning of how much worse it would get once the showrunners ran out of ideas just 3 seasons in and became desperate enough to stir up interest through any means necessary, even if those means involve destroying what once was their greatest achievement. The entire time I watched this season, I couldn't stop thinking that at any moment I was going to wake up and go, oh God, I had this horrible dream that Monster, the Ed Gein story, was incomprehensibly awful. Thank God that didn't actually happen. Time to watch the real thing. Even now, saying all this out loud, I'm still having a hard time believing that any of this is real. I mean, I know it's all a total fabrication. I just mean, I can't believe an entire team of people watched this and approved it for public release. I used to watch this series in a good faith attempt to understand, to give thoughtful and productive analysis that I naively believed might help shape the future of the true crime genre, or at least encourage its audience to engage with this stuff thoughtfully, even when they're enjoying it. But this season has robbed me of any hope or goodwill I had left for this show. How does one give respect to a season of television that shows so little respect for both its subject matter and its own viewers? I mean, really, who exactly is meant to enjoy the show at this point? True crime fans are likely to be disappointed because this isn't the Ed Gein story they were seemingly promised. The veneer of honoring the victims is certainly gone at this point, given that every victim in this story is treated like vapid horror movie fodder. Those who want to know more about how Ed Gein's crimes inspired so many legendary films are surely going to be let down by how shallow and disrespectful the show's commentary on the subject is, and even straight-up horror fans looking to be scared or disturbed, especially due to the implied realism, are probably gonna walk away empty-handed, given that, on the whole, this season is so incredibly goofy. I guess it's for people who want a show filled with incredibly scattershot plot and commentary, as well as completely meaningless cartoonish violence that they can watch around Halloween time. And at that point, can't believe I'm saying this, but just go watch American Horror Story. It's marginally better than whatever the hell this is. It's more clear than ever that the Monster series has no interest in growing or learning, no ambition to push the genre forward in any meaningful way. It's come to the point of self-analyzing into oblivion and managing to walk away with no valuable insight. All I'm hoping for now is that enough of you watching this show, or even just this video itself, feel the same way. That a disappointment this colossal, that this very pointed middle finger for all your support is enough to drive away viewership. But, at least so far, that does not appear to be the case. And even if this season were somehow a massive flop, it's too late anyway. Season 4, Monster, the Lizzie Borden story, is already in production and set for a fall 2026 release. If this show is right about anything, it's that this monster was not created in a vacuum. We all had a part in it, and that, of course, includes me. The train wreck is too morbidly fascinating to turn my head away from. The discourse it generates is too enticing to stop engaging with, and thus the series continues to be too watchable to stop being produced. No matter how bad it turns out, I keep coming back. I'm the problem, and I will never try to deny that. Am I going to review the next season? Selfishly, yeah, I probably will, for 2 reasons. 1, because it'll make for a good video, and 2, because I just can't shake this morbid sense of obligation. If new seasons are going to continue to get churned out year after year, and the show's popularity is going to maintain as strongly as it has, then someone, dear God, anyone, has to thoughtfully engage with it all. I'll never be sure why so many people look to me to be that someone, but hey, even for as jaded as I've become, I'll give it an honest try. If not for them, then for me, because I helped create this monster, and I'm willing to see it to the end. Even if now I'm only hoping to one day bask in the warmth of the funeral pyre. The sad and unglamorous reality is that whether you're pissed off or jumping for joy doesn't really matter, not so long as you keep watching. I mean, after all,
you're the one who can't look away.